Hi, this is finally the most complete video manual for the BlueARP, and it took me quite a long time to prepare, and I was planning to do it for quite a while already, but finally I made it. So I'll try to cover as much as possible, to touch all the settings and to present it in a linear fashion, although it's not possible completely because settings are interconnected and I'll have to jump back and forth. But anyway, I'll try to split it into blocks the best way I can. So if you don't have time to watch the whole thing, please check the time codes for the video and pick up the section you need the most. So let's go. First of all, a few words about this FL Studio setup I have here. There is BlueARP plugin connected to Synth 1, and you can do it in any DAW, but here in FL Studio I'm using this method. In settings, output port should be set to any number not used by the hardware, synths 11 in my case, and for the Synth 1 the same MIDI input port setting should be set to the same number 11, and this way BlueARP sends generated notes to the Synth 1. And also these little locks on the channels, they have kind of fixed MIDI routing. So it's here, right click, receive notes from remote SL, which is my MIDI keyboard, channel 1. And regardless if this plugin is active selected or not, it will receive this MIDI notes, because by default in FL Studio the selected plugin will receive MIDI notes from the keyboard, and I don't want that. And Synth 1 is set the same way, but to the MIDI channel 16, which has nothing, and it's basically the way of muting it, a little trick, because there is no mute or off setting here. So regardless of what is active, it's kind of arpeggiating. And these two visual piano plugins, so to speak, the top one is showing the notes I press on the keyboard, and the bottom one notes generated by the arpeggiator, just for the sake of visual demonstration. Let's move to another program like this simple 4K up sequence, and you see this is my chord I'm currently holding, and these are generated notes. Let's move on. First, let's talk about the GUI Basics, some stuff that might be counterintuitive. Most of the parameters in BlueARP look like this, some value box surrounded by arrow buttons or not. And there are 4 ways to adjust the value. First of all, you can use these arrow buttons to increase or decrease the value. Then you can click and drag up or down to adjust the value. Then you can just place the mouse over the control and use the wheel to change the value. And last but not least, you can right click and it will give you a menu to select the value from the list. Sometimes it may be not complete, like in this case it goes in steps, but then I can use mouse to fine adjust it, or it can be nested like with these notes, or it can be just a flat list like here. And here in the right part, in the metrics editor, we have kind of step related parameters, and clicking on this bar caption also activates it on the metrics. But here on the lane itself I can use all the same methods, except that they don't have these arrow buttons, but right click works, and dragging up and down and mouse wheel also work. And here on the metrics it's pretty intuitive as well. I'm just clicking to set the corresponding value. Then in this settings block we have some important settings like color schemes. There are a set of schemes provided with the plugin, and there are also some third-party ones you can download from my website. And the scaling option, you can pick up the one working best for you depending on your monitor size and DPI. And also there's octave numbering, a tricky setting, but it only affects how BlueARP will show names for the same notes. So for example, I'm pressing C2 and it shows, I'm pressing this note, it shows it at C2, but if I change this to another option, it becomes C4. It's basically the same note, but it's kind of naming convention. So in this FL Studio way, the most left key is C0, but the Yamaha way in many software uses it, the left key is C-2. And I'm using this Yamaha option because it's consistent with this piano plugin. So it's basically C2 and C2 on this virtual keyboard as well. Now let's move on to the top panel. Here we have some essential options in the patch browser or program browser. The state, arpeggiator state, it's on by default, but other option is off, which is obviously muted, it does nothing. Or through, it will pass the notes through without any arpeggiation. And there are these alternative tricky settings like 2 or 3 keys automatic on off or on through. And the way it works is that for 3 key automatic on off, when I press 1 or 2 keys less than 3, it keeps idle. Once I press 3 keys, it starts arpeggiating, and 2 keys again, it's idle again. And on through mode is the same, but when there's less than 3 keys pressed, it passes the notes through, but once I have 3 keys, it starts arpeggiating. So going back to on option, operation mode, it's arpeggiator by default, and there's also drum sequencer mode, which was introduced recently in version 2.5.0, if I'm correct. We won't cover it in this video because it will be pretty long, and in drum sequencer mode, BlueARP will virtually become a different plugin designed to sequence drums. So please check introductory video to the version 2.5.0 to get the idea how it works. Maybe someday I'll make a separate video for this, but now we'll stick to arpeggiator mode. Then the program patch browser, and program patch or preset, it's basically the same, just different software and different synthesizers use different words, and program is the core way, and I'm using the term program in BlueARP, but they're all the same. So you can switch programs with these buttons, or you can select program from this nested list this way, or you can even drag up and down this control. And a side note, there is a small trick if you need to experiment, tweak the program, but if you don't want to lose the original one, you can use this right-click option, duplicate. It will create the same program on the next slot, 5 in this case, and you can edit that preset without spoiling the original one. And we are moving to the next chapter. Let's talk about this matrix. This matrix editor is obviously where you'll spend most of the time if you want to program your own patterns. And let's go back to the initial program, which you have when you just loaded the BlueARP. It's that boring 16th notes sequence. So let's decrease the gate time just to make it the melody more pronounceable. And first of all, the key select lane. And it works pretty simple. So if I'm pressing several keys, I can choose which key will play at which step of the sequence. So this is the way it works. And important thing here, and if I press just one key and my sequence has more than one key, these steps that are key 2 or key 3, they remain idle. They don't make any sound, because I have this missing key substitution setting set to don't play, which is default. So I'm not having keys 2 and 3 in my input list, and they're not playing. But once I change it to, for example, first key, they will be substituted. So keys 2 and 3, if they're missing in my input key list, they will take a key from the key 1. So it doesn't make any difference when I have all the keys, but if I don't, it makes a difference. And for example, the last key, it means that it will be substituted with the last key in the sequence. Or for example, cyclic. It will go kind of in circle, D2, F2, D2, F2. And by the way, these are two important things. Input keys pre-filter is the keys that I'm pressing that BlueARP receives from the keyboard, and post-filter is what we have after note ordering and missing key substitution, which we'll touch a bit later. So what goes into the arpeggiator core, basically. And fixed key, it's a bit tricky, but missing keys will be substituted with this key defined by this setting. So missing keys also always substituted by this A2. Might be interesting in some cases as well. There are two special options here. Like again, fix is that I can set some steps to be this fixed key, A2 in my case. So part of my melody will depend on the keys that I press, and part of it won't. Let's move it back. And then RT means root. So it will be root key of the detected chord. And if I set, let me set all the steps to RT, and in this case BlueARP will try to detect the chord, and it will be the so for example, now I'm playing A minor inverted and the second inversion, and here I still have A2 because that's the root key of my detected chord, and you can see the detected chord here. It's AM, no matter which inversion I play. And for example, F major, F minor. So this is the way it works. Back to key 1. Last but not least, we have this tiny thing here, which can switch this key select line to the polyphonic mode. And now I can have more than one key for a certain step. And here this asterisk, it shows that there are more than one key for this step, and so I can change it only in the matrix, not here. Here it's impossible now for the polyphonic steps. And once I switch the lane back to the monophonic mode, all these extra polyphonics values will be removed automatically. Now let's reset it to key 1. And a side note, you can just drag the mouse over the matrix to set all the steps to a certain value. And now let's go to the octave lane. I think it's easier than the key select. It just applies octave transposition to a certain steps. For example, I can set it to -1 or even -2. Might be great for bass lines or trance-like arpeggios. The same way I can transpose some steps up. Again, we have polyphonic option here, so I can have more than one output note for a step like this. And you can see here in the note out section, for certain steps more than one note lights up. Yeah, by side note, right clicking somewhere, I can set all the steps to a certain value. Now let's move to the step type. It's a bit more tricky. So by default, we have all steps set to normal. Let's create some simple sequence. It will be easier to explain. Now we have this 1, 2, 3 up sequence. Obviously, when I switch some steps to off, they will be muted. Then rest step type means that it will extend the note from the previous step, like this. Then I think tie step type is the most tricky here, and it's designed to create kind of glides between the notes. But to make it work, we need to set up our synth properly, and I'll try to do this. I need to set it to legato, set portamento to automatic, and some non-zero value. So basically what it does is when I press consecutive notes like note A, keep it pressed, then press note B and release note A, so kind of my notes intersect in time like this way, not this way with gaps, but this way when they intersect. Synth will create this gliding effect between the notes, and let's check how it sounds. So you see this glides. If I'm not setting portamento to auto, it will glide all the time, not only when the notes intersect. So if I'm switching back to poly, there's no gliding. So yeah, it's important to set the synth in right way to make it work. Now let's move back to normal for all the steps. And what else? We have this chord step type, which is pretty simple. It will trigger all the notes at the same time. This way. And random, it will just randomly select any key from the input list. And in this case, what we have on the key select won't matter. It will just randomly select the key. Sometimes they're repeating, but basically it's a random note from the list. Next lane is velocity, and it's pretty simple. We can change the velocity of the output notes. But it depends on this setting, output node velocity. By default, it's velocity lane. It means that output node velocity is completely controlled by this lane. We can change it to input key, and then it won't depend. Now it's quiet because I'm pressing softly, and if I press hard, the velocity is higher. And lane plus input key is kind of fusion between the two. So it will adjust to the input velocity, but still will take this lane into account. But let's move to the default velocity lane. Let's reset it. And our next lane is gate time, and here we can have we can set gate time per step as a multiplication of this global gate time, which is in our case 50% of our step length. It works like this. You you see some notes became longer, and as my synth is polyphonic, output notes began overlapping. And I can also set them shorter, like this. Extending gate time might be useful for guitar-like pickup sounds, for example. Then we have this tiny element. It allows to switch the lane between default gate per step mode and channel per step mode, which will switch output channel for certain steps. I can't demonstrate it here because the synth is monotimbral, but if you have something multitimbral like Roland Virtual Sound Canvas, which can react to different channels and have different instruments, might be a nice option to create kind of sophisticated performances. What else we have left? We have, last but not least, scale step lane. And let's set it to key 1 here, just for the sake of simplicity. And by default, it will apply semitone transposition to the output node. Now it's complete mess because it doesn't follow any scale, and it depends on this block of setting: force to scale, root key, scale, and mode. And by default it's chromatic. But for example, I can say that I want my scale to be fixed A. It means it's fixed, it doesn't depend on the input notes A and minor. So basically simple A minor scale, all the whites. And let's make it simple from 0 to +7. It basically plays the A minor scale. Also, there is a nice GUI option here. I can change the range of this matrix editor, so maybe this way a bit more convenient. Let's set it the way so that each odd step will be the increasing step of the scale. And you see, no matter which key I start from, it stays within this A minor scale. So this is the way it works. Also, there's tricky setting here: force to scale mode, all keys or semi-transposed. By default, it will force all the keys into the scale or just the semi-transposed. There is a separate video on my channel about this, so you can check that one. Now let's set it back to the default, and also there is a special setting here: detect from chord for both root key and the scale. And in this case it will try to derive the scale from the chord that I press on the keyboard. It's not like the arranger's work, but maybe something alike. So, for example, now I'm playing A minor, the same sequence up, just the whole scale played. It's A minor and this is A major. And this is C major, for example. So this way, this is the most arranger-like behavior you can get from the BlueARP in this mode. You can program some melody here and it will follow the chords more or less like the arranger would do. So we are done with the lanes, I think. The next thing is pages. if you have your sequence longer than 16 steps, for example, let's set it to 64 steps, which is maximum, and I press play, so that my whole sequence doesn't fit this single matrix screen display, so to speak. And in this case, I have to use these page buttons to go through the pages. The top LED here on the lane shows the page being edited, shown on the screen currently. And the bottom LED is the page that is actually playing. So when they match, we see this running LED indicating the current step. And I can check this auto scroll box, and then this displayed page will always follow the page being played, but it might be not very convenient for editing, because while I edit, it may jump to another page. And there is also let me play some there's also this page lock checkbox, and when I check it, it will stay on the same page as long as it's checked, and I can edit that part of the sequence while it's playing, and when I'm done, I uncheck it and it goes into the normal mode, looping through all the pages. Also, we have this pattern shift buttons, which will basically rotate the pattern. I guess this is the way it's called. So if you rotate it right, the last step will jump to the beginning, so it will just cycle over and over. Then last thing here is this menu button. There's a lot of stuff hidden inside. And the main thing you need here is bank load and save from file or a single program, and this way you can save your presets, or you can exchange them with the BlueARP DM, which is a hardware implementation of BlueARP. You can also find some information on my website. Next, let's go to the left panel, and there's a lot of settings here. First, the input filter. What it does, it kind of pre-processing the incoming notes before they pass into the arpeggiator engine. And here I encourage you to look at the manual. On page 14 it has this signal flow diagram, which will give you some insights about how the BlueARP works, basically how the signal flows through the BlueARP different blocks, and they are arranged just the same way. We have this input filter which truncates the input notes for a certain range, or orders them, substitutes the missing keys, and we have this input keys pre-filter and post-filter. After all this stuff, all that stuff is done, then they go into the arpeggiator engine, and then finally to the output filter. So back to the input filter block. First of all, we have this input range filter, and what it does, it's possible to limit the input range of the incoming notes. By default, it will accept the whole keyboard range, but I can narrow it, for example, for this range on my keyboard, like from C2 to C3. And by the way, the easy way to set the MIDI key is to select this press MIDI key option by right clicking, and then it will wait for the MIDI input, then press the desired key, and we're done. So now what happens is that when I press anything outside of that range, it will not make any sound, and it will ignore that keys outside of the range. But if I change this input range mode option to pass through no arping, it means that outside the range keys will be just passed through, and this one will keep arpeggiating. I can use that if I, for example, want some simple bass line to play on my left hand, and still on the same instrument I want to play some leads with the right hand. This way. Back to the default values. Next we have this input range rep. It works a bit differently. So for example, let's set it to this range, from C3 to C4. And what it will do, when input keys are outside of this range, it will try to octave transpose them so they will fit into that range. So for example, if I press A3, we can see that input keys pre-filter and post-filter are both A3. If I press A2, input is A2, but post filter is A3. It was transposed here, and you can see, let's change it to the default boring pattern just so my input and output node is the same for the sake of demonstration. So A3 in both cases. Sorry, some stuck note here. Now A2 here, A3 here, as you see. A4 here, A3 here. So it gets wrapped into this particular range. Now let's get back to the default. Next, missing key substitution. In 2012, when I first released BlueARP, it was pretty unique setting, but now many ARPs do this, I guess. So what it does, for example, I have simple sequence going up 1, 2, 3, 4. But if I press just one key, listen what happens. Those steps having keys from key 2 to key 4, they are silent, they don't make any sound. When I have two keys, key 3 and key 4 are kind of muted, they don't make any sound. Because in my input key list there are no key 3 and key 4, there are just two keys, D3 and F3. So I can tell BlueARP that when there are missing keys like this, substitute it with the first key from the list. And this is exactly what happens here. D3, E3 and D3 for the rest key slots, so to speak, was substituted with the last key. D3 and F3 till the last key. Or cyclic, it will kind of substitute them in a cyclic fashion. D3, F3, D3, F3. Or a fixed key, it will be substituted with this fixed key option, which is A2 in my case. Back to the default don't play. Next, a very important setting, order algorithm. By default it's by pitch, so from lowest to highest note. But also I can set it by pitch descending. And also we have S played, pretty tricky, so it will matter in which sequence I press the keys, not the pitches, but the one I pressed earlier is the first. So now I'm pressing them in the natural order from left to right, or from right to left, the same sequence, or by velocity. By the way, this S-plate descending might be useful for the bass lines, because key 1 will always be the last pressed key. So when you play complicated bass lines, it might be pretty useful. Then by velocity, I don't use it much, but again, might be useful for someone, maybe. A chord normalized. This is the tricky one. BlueARP will try to detect the chord you play and then arrange the notes as for the normalized chord. For example, I'm pressing A minor. Let me change the sequence to the simple 1 2 3 1, and I'm pressing A minor, and it plays just A minor in a natural order. But now it's A minor inverted, but the result is still the same because my output chord should be normalized, as this setting says. And another inversion of A minor. But if I switch to chord as played, it will, inverted chord will stay inverted. Yeah, by pitch is probably the one we'll use the most, but don't forget there are the ordering options here, and especially as played descending is very useful for the bass lines. Next, missing key substitution also has this missing key transpose option. So for example, if I have first key like this one, and I have some missing keys that are substituted, I can also transpose them up one octave, like this way, or down one octave. Now, input quantize is the real-time input quantization for my pressed chords. By default, it's 16th notes, but I can set it to, for example, 1 beat, 4th notes. And in this case, you see my input keys pre-filter immediately reflect the keys that I'm pressing on the keyboard, and post-filter is only with respect to quantization. If I set it to something, some large value like 1 bar, we can see it clearly. You can see only on the beginning, on the next bar, when it jumps to the first step, it gets changed. So my personal favorite is 4th notes or the whole beats. Then the smart band. Actually, it's not working in this version. Probably I broke something in the latest releases, but it was experimental. It's still experimental. The idea was to mimic kind of the guitar shredding sounds with this control. Probably I'll fix it in some next releases. Then arpeggiator, important setting. When set to latch, it will kind of hold the input chord after I release all the keys. Might be useful if you need, if you want to free your hands to tweak the controls while the sequence is playing. Notes off will just cut down all the input notes. And the important thing is that it's connected to this setting here, sustain message. By default it's arpeggiator, so if you have sustain pedal connected to your MIDI keyboard and you press the sustain pedal, it will trigger arpeggiator automatically. Or you can disconnect it with ignore setting for sustain message, but this default routing works pretty well, I think. And except latch that holds the input chord, there's also latch plus sustain option, which will not only hold the input chord but also will sustain the generated notes, and it's great for the guitar sounds. Not for this one, but just for the sake of demonstration. I guess you'll get the idea. So this is the way it works. And this button nodes off, it obviously will cut all the input and output nodes. It's like the panic button in many DAWs. A side note on order algorithms ascending and descending might be tricky to understand, but I'll try to explain. So by default, by pitch ascending, it's pretty simple. Kind of key 1 is the lowest, key 3 is the highest. But when we have the full chord, like my sequence uses 3 keys and I'm pressing 3-key chord, kind of I have all the steps having their own keys in the input list, and missing key substitution is don't play to keep the things simple. And when my order algorithm is by pitch, I have this, and when I switch to descending, nothing changes actually. But you can see it flips here. And the trick is that now my key 1 is my lowest key and key 3 is the highest. And when I switch to by pitch descending, now my key 3 is the lowest and key 1 is the highest. But the sequence stays the same. And I'll hear the difference if I'm pressing just one key. So now key 1 is step 1, step 4, step 7 and so forth. And with descending, key 1 is step 3, step 6, step 9 and so forth. And let's check it with the kick to give you the better idea. So by pitch ascending and descending. So will be musically even more different if I set it to cyclic, for example, missing key substitution, and use 2 keys chord. So in this case, by pitch descending, I have these lower notes only when I press 3 keys. These -1 steps. And if I go back to ascending, I always have my bass note. So yeah, it's a bit tricky, but at least now you know you can experiment with that and with missing key substitution setting and get different results and kind of pick up the one you like the most. Next block of settings is ARP engine. It defines how the arpeggiator core works basically together with this pattern programmed in the matrix. The first and the most obvious one is the number of steps. If it's less than 16, some of them will be grayed out or inactive in the matrix. If we have more, then we have to use this pattern page element we talked already about to scroll through the pages. Now let's go back to 16. Sync is basically the speed of our arpeggio, either 16th notes or 8th notes or 1/4 or the whole beat. Then gate time, obviously length of the generated notes as a fraction of the step length, and it can be even a bit longer than 100%. And also, as we touched before, it can be affected in a stepwise way by this gate time lane. back to 16th notes, and then next one is swing. So the even step numbers will be shifted either left or right, depending on this setting. Just the way it works in many drum machines and other synthesizers. Then fixed key is kind of, if you have key select fixed for some of the steps, it will take this key from here. So part of my sequence will not depend on the input key, but on this fixed key setting. Back to the default A2. And a side note, I can switch BlueARP to step sequencer mode by setting all the key select steps to fixed. And so my sequence now doesn't depend on the input keys. And I can apply some octave and semitone transposition, mute some steps, and I just created a simple fixed sequence. But keep in mind that BlueARP will not play anything unless it has some note input. So if there are no input notes, it won't play. At least some dummy note should be present at the input. And we let's set it back to key 1 and reset the octave and reset it here as well. Next we have this restart on option, and by default it's bit 0, means that it's hardwired to the song position. So let's check how it works. So if I jump through my song, you see that this step indicating LED jumps immediately because it's hardwired to the song position. Basically, this is the way it works. If I switch it to key, for example, then the arpeggiator will only play when some chord is pressed, and it will start always from the beginning. With respect to this input quantize, of course. With this first key setting, it will wait for the first key, and then it will keep cycling over and over, unless I stop the playback. And with play option, it will start wherever I start my playback. It will start from the beginning. So bit 0 is default. I think it's kind of the most intuitive when it's hardwired to the host song position. Output note velocity, we touched that already. It defines where the output note velocity is taken from, either from this velocity line completely, like in this case, or just from the input key. So back to default here and there. This force to scale block of settings, we'll touch that already when we talked about scale step. So basically it will define either these are just semitones or steps of some scale, like in this case, just semitones or steps of A minor scale. Back to the default. Then the output filter block, which finally does some post-processing on the generated notes. And this is, first let's recreate some of the simple note sequence here for the sake of demonstration, like -1 for some of the steps. Octave transpose, just octave transposition of the whole generated sequence. The the same but for semitones. Transposing the whole output basically. Output range wrap, it works just like the input range wrap, but for the generated notes. So let's try to apply it here, for example, for this key range from C2 to C3. And you see we lost this kind of octave spread of the sound because it fits into a single octave. So not a good musical example here, sorry, just to demonstrate the way it works. Then randomized velocity will add some random velocity shift to the output. So you hear it's too much of it probably, but again, just to demonstrate the way it works. But subtle amounts might be good, especially for the electronic music when you want to make it less repetitive and boring. Randomized gate time will kind of add some random value to the gate time, obviously. Some become shorter, some longer in a random way, as you hear. Again, a slight touch of it might be a nice addition to make a sequence less repetitive. And randomized start will just randomly shift some of the notes to the right. Might work well for the drum sequences, I think, better than for the melodic lines. So we covered everything here in the arpeggiator main tab. Now let's check the stuff in this settings tab. We have MIDI routing first, MIDI input and output channel, pretty obvious. I think MIDI input channel, any or all channels, BlueARP will receive notes from any MIDI channel, or if you set to a specific one, for example channel 5, it will ignore all the other MIDI channels at the input. MIDI output channel where to send the generated notes, and this MIDI through mode setting doesn't make much sense in FL Studio and in Windows. I think mostly it was created for the Logic Pro on Mac, where it's impossible to route plugins in parallel to the same synth, or even not Logic Pro, in Main Stage, which has the same architecture, I think. And there you can only chain plugins, but still this setting allows you to circumvent that limitation and to use them like they're in parallel. I have a separate video on my channel like how to use Monster Guitar plugin in Main Stage, so check that one if you're interested. This MIDI filters section, it shows what to do with certain incoming MIDI CC messages. For example, program change, either ignore it or set BlueARP's program when it receives the program change message, or pass through to the connected synth. And all the same for the mod wheel, but only ignore or pass through by default. Sustain, it's a bit tricky when you have sustain pedal connected. By default, when you press it, it will trigger this arpeggiator option. So you can use sustain pedal to control the arpeggiator, or you can pass it through to the synth. Other MIDI CC messages, except these ones, either ignore or pass through. Sustain pedal polarity, aftertouch and pitch bend, all the same, either ignore or pass through to the synth. So I think the ones that are defaulted here make the most musical sense, so in many cases you won't have to change these settings, just leave them default. Scale step range for the matrix editor, we touched it briefly already. By default it's -12 to +12, but you can change that from 0 to +12, or from -7 to 7, or even from 0 to +7. might be useful for the touch screens mostly. And the GUI block we already covered in the beginning, some color schemes to choose from, or scaling options depending on the monitor and resolution you have, an octave numbering, just naming convention for the notes, nothing more. So back to here. Now let's talk about chains, the important performance tool. If you have several programs and want to switch them real time during your performance, of course you can use just program switching, and you can even send program change messages to the BlueARP, and with this setting set on program it will react and switch its programs, but this program switching won't be quantized. And if you want it to be quantized, and just the designed way to switch programs during the performance is to use chains. The chain is basically an ordered sequence of programs that they just play in a sequence. Here, for example, the factory bank chain 1, we have programs 35 and 34 3 times. And we have 8 slots here. We can use up to 8 slots, fill them all, or use just one slot like here. So let's check how it works. The white rectangle indicates the currently playing chain step. And when I switch the chain, you can see this white rectangle lights up for a while. It means that chain is in the switching state. It's not yet switched because of the chain switch quantization, this setting here. And if we set it to some long value like 1 bar, let's check how it works. This switching period will just become longer. And you see it's from 2 to 3, from 3 to 4, switching right now. So pretty easy. You can have up to 16 chains. This number of chains setting 8 by default, it defines full range of this current chain parameter. And if you gonna automate it, for example, here, last tweaked link to controller, accept, and now we have chain linked to this knob. And it utilizes the full rotation range of the knob, so up to 8 chains. And if I change that, for example, to 4, my full rotation range will be just 4 chains, or 16 chains maximum. Just for the sake of convenience, switching chains. And another thing I used a lot of my earlier performances, I set this row of buttons to the single CC but different values. And with these buttons I can switch chains for different BlueARP instances. Let's go back to default here. Another setting in chains is the next chain option. It will automatically switch to that chain after this current chain plays once. For example, if I set it to chain 2 and play my chain 1, so it moved to chain 2. For example, then I want to jump to chain 4 from chain 2. Let's check it again. Chain 1 plays once, then chain 2. And now we're on chain 4. And if here I set it to chain 1 again, it will kind of loop in a long cycle. Chain 4, plays once, back to chain 1, then chain 2. Let's reset it here, and another option how to use it is, for example, after chain 1 I want to jump to chain 4, And then on chain 4 I want to jump back to color. Color means the chain it was invoked from. So it will work like this. After chain 1 plays once, it will jump to chain 4 and then back to chain 1, the chain it was called from. Might be useful for some stuff like drum fills. So let's reset it again. Then we have these options bank and patch. And what they do basically, I can set for a certain chain to set program change message to a synth. For example, for chain 1 I have patch number 8 and it immediately switched on the synth 1 to number 9, and that because here it's 0 based and here probably program numbering starts from 1, that's why 8 here, 9 here. For the chain 2, for example, patch number 12, you see it's immediately reflecting here, and here patch number 20. So I'm switching my chains and it gets reflected on my synth immediately. I don't have any programs here, so I can't show anything musical with this example, but you can also change a bank. You see it's not working except 0. It switches to 99, but I can try these options. Send bank message format. Different for different synths, and sometimes it helps. But not with synth 1, unfortunately. But for some other hardware synths it might work. But here, just even without a bank, it's enough to have a lot of flexibility during the performance if you want to switch your sounds. And also it can send volume change along with the program change message. And I'm going to reload my project because I spoiled. Now let's continue with the chains. Chain variations, which were introduced recently, it's another level of complexity on top of chains. So I can, for example, for chain variation 1, pick up another program like 36, for example. This is my default variation, this is my variation 1. And the condition is kind of the equation. When it gets triggered, when the condition is true, this variation will trigger automatically. And it might be, for example, the root note of the detected chord, which I want to be E. So let's check how it works. This is my default chain variation. And I have AM chord right now inverted. And since I press E chord, my variation 1 fires automatically. Other chord, not E, and then E again. So cool way to have different sequences which you can switch on the so for example a specific sequence for a specific chord. Other than that, I can use simple chords, which is, for example, E minor in this case. So playing E major, my default variation, and E minor, my specific variation 1. Other chords, the default variation. And this dot indicates that variation 1 is active, not initial, so to speak. Back to variation 1. Also, I can set, for example, the condition like highest velocity of the input keys should be greater or equal 104. And it will work like this. This is my default variation. And if I hit hard any of the keys, this is my specific variation 1. hit it softly, again back to the default variation. By the way, I used it, you can check shorts on my channel. I used it to trigger drum fills when BlueARP is in drum sequencer mode. Variations work just the same way. So let's reset our variation 1 just this way. That's because I have program here. It still says that the variation is not initial. Yep. Back to program chains block on the left panel, number of chains. It will define the full range for the current chain parameter. Chain quantize. It's the quantization, real-time input quantization for chain switching. Send bank message defines bank and program change message format. Different options might work for the different synths. Just if it doesn't work for yours, check all of them. And restart chain on switch. It's a bit tricky, but basically when we switch the chain with this option on, it will always start from the first chain step, not from somewhere in the middle as it would be otherwise, but always from the beginning. So let's set it to 1/4, because if I switch that off, you can see it might start from somewhere in the middle, because it's still hardwired to the song position. And when restart chain on switch is active, the next chain will always start from the beginning, no matter where the current song position is. So that's it with the chains. The next chapter is this information panel. It might give some additional information, especially if you use the controller to control BlueARP or just visualize some of the things. For example, input filter. Let's go back to some simple program like this one. So input keys pre-filter is always the actual keys that I'm pressing on the keyboard as they go into this input filter block. And post filter is what do we have after all the substitution and ordering. Output node, obviously the generated node, it can be several of them at the same time. The detected chord is displayed here. External and internal position. If we have our DAW playing in a loop, for example, let's make a short loop here. You can see that external position is basically the song position BlueARP is getting from host. But if I change restart on to play, for example, we can see that when the host loops over and starts from 0, internal position keeps advancing. And internal position is basically that will drive the ARP. So the song position with respect to BlueARP's internal adjustments and then this restart on option. If I change it to key, for example, you can see both initial 0 and they will start advancing only if I press something. And this is the step, basically the same you can see on this LED line indication. And last but not least, this element indicates the last changed parameter. And not only the parameter number, but also its internal and external value. For example, the chain. Let's take the chain because this is the most important thing for automation. You can see now we have 8 chains maximum, and here it shows the internal value. So -1 is no chain. chain 1 is the value 0, and this 15 is the MIDI CC value you need to set this chain value. So you see it's 15, then 29, then 43. It's kind of odd because we have 8 chains, but also this no current chain value, which is -1. If we change number of chains to 7, for example, so the total number of values will be 8. We have kind of nice values here, like chain 1 is 16, chain 2 is 32. So you can configure your buttons to send these values of the same CC, and you will switch chains this way. So basically with any parameter you can see which MIDI CC number do you need to invoke this particular parameter value. And with chains, for example, if we have 15 here and 29 here, then any value between 15 and 29 minus 1, 28, will invoke current chain number 1. So not only 15, but all the values above to the next value, basically. And I think that's it. Let's move to the next chapter. And as a conclusion, speaking of tips and tricks, I'll share my favorite one. One of my favorites is combining root and fixed step types on the key select lane with the normal key 1 to key 5 steps. So for example, we have this simple up sequence. And for the bass note, so let's move down the bass note for a certain steps. Oh yeah, and another trick, you can swap the steps actually this way. I introduced it recently, so yep, I can so let's do some swapping here and move some steps to -1. And now let's change this key 1 with -1 octave. Let it be my bass note, and let's change it to root step type. And here I'll just set to key 1 some more steps like this, and let's check how it sounds. I think I wanna make my root steps even lower. Let's add some delay. Yeah. Yep, so this is the sequence I just made up in several minutes. So I hope you find it useful, or at least a part of it if you didn't watch the whole thing. That's it for now. Thanks for watching, have fun with BlueARP, and see you next time.